For those of you who weren't here yesterday, I'm Michael Knight. I'm the Senior Curator of Chinese Art and Deputy Director for Strategic Programs and Partnerships at the Asian Art Museum. And welcome to this morning's session. It's awfully beautiful outside. It must be a dedicated group here to come in and do this today. I don't have much to say this morning. I'm really going to turn the program over to the participants, except to kind of talk a little bit about our chief partner in crime here, Wen Xinye. Not a relative of Max and Yetong of the family, but the person who's been with us from Berkeley all the way from the beginning of this project up to now. She wrote part of the catalog, but she was also part of that whole process of kind of wooing the Max and Yetong and getting the collection to come to us. So a person that we owe a great deal of debt to. And I think she's going to start the conference off this morning. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And it's truly a pleasure on behalf of both the Asian Art Museum and the Institute of East Asian Studies at the university to welcome all of you to our joint conference here. The title, of course, of our gathering is Elegant Gathering, and I couldn't help reflecting both upon being elegant and also on the whole notion of gathering or assembling. And from the perspective of what I have experienced as a result of taking part in this program, then this has been an occasion for gathering, meeting, converging in at least 3 different ways. First of all, of course, as Michael alluded to just now, although my last name is Ye, but this is no relation to the family collection. But I could claim the honor, the privilege, the good fortune of having known George Ye, Ambassador George Ye, that's Tong and Max's father, when I was actually a mere teenager. In other words, George was a good friend, a close friend with my father. So it was through Max and Tong's discussion of gifting this family collection to the Asian Art Museum and bringing the collection intact to San Francisco area that I had my first opportunity meeting with Tong and with Max. Now, Max, in his contribution to the catalog, as Jonathan Hay has pointed out yesterday, invoked powerfully a sense of how that through a collection, there is both a sense of continuity and of loss. Namely, when it comes to objects of art, it's really a questionable concept. Who's got the ownership of something like that? So to the extent that a collection is being put together, one is also anticipating a moment of dispersal. So, but then on the other hand, it seems to me that precisely through my conversations for 2 years now, 3 years, in our conversations over the whole subject of continuity, connections, collection, as well as dispersal, that I've discovered, I've learned from him a sense of how meaningful connections can be made across time, across space, through the kind of understanding which may not be immediately apparent or self-evident in the intent or the design of the collection, but nonetheless, it's a kind of meeting, converging, and gathering across time and space. So for that, I wish to thank Max and Tong for that. And then the next point of converging or gathering derives also from Max's and Tong's very strong belief that a collection is not just a collection of beautiful objects there in themselves. It's something that comes to life only when they are being viewed, being used, being thought of, hence been talked about in academic settings such as this. So spurred by Max's inspiration as well as articulation of that agenda, here we are happily today for a kind of strategic partnership between the Asian Art Museum and the University of California at Berkeley. So for this gathering to have come together, I wish to thank in particular Michael Knight and Pauline Yao for doing all the work to make it possible. And beyond our strategic partnership, there is yet another level of gathering or meeting, which is in part enabled by our partnership with the Asian Art Museum. Namely, on this campus, even though we are all fellow units under the umbrella of the same university, the Institute for East Asian Studies and the Berkeley Art Museum, in my experience, have hardly ever spoken to each other on such intensive collegial and collaborative level until this very occasion. So on that score, I wish to thank Dennis Love of the Berkeley Art Museum on behalf of all of us for making this event possible. So with these remarks as a way to open the gathering, I now turn over to my colleague, Professor Patricia Berger of the Department of Art History to conduct the first panel. Pat, please.
Thank you, Wen-Chin, for those very apt remarks. Our first panel today concerns art and collecting, and actually the order of panels over the course of the day was designed to begin with a kind of celebration of the Ye family collection coming to the Asian Art Museum. And I think rightly so, our first speaker is actually Max Ye, whom I think we all know is the son of Ye Gongqiao, and an independent scholar at this point in his career who was born in China and educated in America and in Europe. Max has had an incredibly interesting scholarly career. He received his BA from Amherst College and his MA from Columbia University in Russian literature. He went on to receive a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Iowa. And during his active teaching career, he taught comparative literature and art history at the University of Iowa, the University of California at Irvine, and also at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. On top of everything else, he is a writer of fiction and has a work out called The Beginning of the East, which was published in 1992. Today, he comes to us to speak on the subject of art, art reception, and art history, or the Chinese artist as a running rabbit. Please join me in welcoming Max Ye.
Thanks, Pat. I realized coming over here this morning that I use a word in this paper which, in a way, which is a little unusual, so I think I better start by just telling you what this word is and what I mean by it. The word is topos. It's a Greek word, the plural of which is topoi, and traditionally it's a rhetorical term. It means, oh, you know, there were those people who always quoted Latin quotes at you at various occasions. That's a topos, that is the fitting of a passage or citation to a particular occasion. And I take this to, in a kind of an extensive way, to mean the fitting of any kind of thought structure, actually, or idea or concept automatically and applying it to some particular situation. I'm basically going to talk about topoi, about art, that is the automatic underlying assumptions we make about art when we think about art or engage in art or something like that. So I will begin with what is traditionally in Latin rhetoric called a humility topos. I'm trained in Western art and culture and am totally unqualified to speak of Chinese art. I can only offer a comparative view from the outside, which may explain but not excuse my triteness, foolishness, or presumption, all of which I admit and apologize for. Now, oddly, this traditional Latin topos I've just used closely matches humility formulas of traditional China. However, it is certainly clear that the ways in which this topos of public speaking and civic legal argumentation persisted through the rhetorical handbooks of the Middle Ages, through the mid-19th century school texts, to the opening formulas at Rotary Club luncheons today, differ radically from the ways in which the similar topos was continued in China, which had no public speaking tradition. Things in different cultures might look alike, but their formation, general situation and use in society, and their meanings might be radically different. That is my theme for today. So in Western culture, a curious predisposition towards biographical emphasis has characterized art, art history, and aesthetics ever since the late Middle Ages, when the architect and sculptor Gisela Bertus first autographed his cathedral at Autun. Perhaps he was influenced to assert himself as creator in imitation of the religious belief which all the artists of the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance served. In the 20th century, when Martin Heidegger tried to shift the terms of discussion away from that creator bias to a discussion of art as an ontological truth, he formulated the impasse of that biographical topos as a circular definition that art is what is made by artists. Indeed, the whole of Renaissance and post-Renaissance pictorial art in Europe arose on the basis of the upward movement of the artist from an anonymous craftsman to the heroic figure of artist. That essentially 14th century sociological event was codified 200 years later by Europe's first great art historian, Vasari, in his On the Lives of the Best Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, so that the whole of Western art history became focused on the artist as the creator of the artwork. This movement of the artist into the foreground of art and of art history is paralleled, in fact acted out, by the invention of perspective as a technique for representing pictorial space, because perspective is simply the geometric consequence of fixing the artist's place relative to the objects he represents, and thus fixing as well the location of the viewer. In perspective, the I, E-Y-E, is the I, the me. And therefore, all Western painting, even those modern paintings that do not use perspective, insist on the painter's subjectivity. That congruence of the I with the I is why the portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife at their betrothal in 1434 shows the painter himself reflected in a mirror at the painting's vanishing point, which geometrically locates the viewing point of the artist, and also why the painter's signature is in the form of a legal act of eye-witnessing. Johannes de Eyck fuit hic. Jan van Eyck was here. Kilroy. This congruency explains why Western art is the only art in the world to develop the major genre of self-portraiture. It explains the romantic and post-romantic myth of the creative artist, which still enthralls us to the extent that we accept a blank canvas as a painting, if we're told so. It explains also why modern feminist art historians speak of the gaze, that sexualized regard shared by the male artist and viewer. And one needs only think of how hard both artists and art historians have worked to individualize artistic style throughout the history of Western art to see how extensively Western art depends on the heroic notion of the artist. The style is the man, we say, articulating the topos underlying Heidegger's critique. In contrast to this art that centers the artist's self, Chinese art has another and different history. Should we apply to Chinese art the same artist-centered definition, just because we also have art and artists? I suggest not, because I will argue that Chinese art is characterized by a decentering of the artist. Just the lack of self-portraiture might alert us to the absence of the artist hero in Chinese art. I don't mean that the Chinese tradition does not make a big deal about artists and artistic fame, nor that individual stylistic traits are not discernible and self-conscious, especially after the 14th century. But it seems to me that the forms of Chinese art do not derive out of any similar perceptual centering of the artist within the aesthetic construct. Chinese painting has no perspective. To speak of verticality or some other notion as a Chinese perspective misunderstands both perspective and Chinese painting. Perspective constructs a geometric means to handle the problem of distance in relation to a particular point of view, the eye. Its result proposes an illusion of rectilinear perceptual space which holds all the shown objects in a single relationship to each other. In contrast, depth does not seem to me to arise in Chinese paintings as a representational problem of illusionistic space. The painter Zhang Chaosen told me that in Western painting, you stand and look at the world, but in Chinese painting, one enters it, walks through it, and considers all its aspects. This simple distinction between Chinese and Western painting seems to me accurate in several ways. First, it recognizes the place of perspective in Western art as a specifically visual construct and one that necessarily separates the viewer from the viewed, what Brunelleschi, the inventor of synthetic perspective, thought of as a window. And second, it describes the experience of a Chinese painting as an inner passage into the painting rather than an outer looking, as a continuity of multiple experiences, and the viewing having itself a history, that is, a story and a narration unrolling in time. Chinese painting seems not to pose the problem of distance, but has the flatness of a moving presence. I am reminded of how one looks at a hand scroll, following the landscape as it is revealed. I am also reminded of a visit years ago to the Cernouchy in Paris, where a bored guard told me that the peculiar thing about Chinese landscapes was that if I climbed up the stairs to the side of the gallery, I could look over the mountains into the valleys behind. As the viewer enters the Chinese painting, he is invited to look this way and that, to look to the side to see some rock forms or orchids, to look down in order to see the verge of the lake where land and water meet, to look ahead to see the outlines of a budding tree, or to look up into the distance to see the backdrop of hills. In all these views, the painter chooses the angle of vision which can be called privileged in the sense that these angles of viewing provide the shapes which allow most easily our recognition of the object and thus closely conforms to our visual concept of the object. These privileged angles of viewing are tremendously important topoi in Chinese painting. The Chinese painters would not, for example, depict a coin as a thin rectangle, that is, seen on edge, but would always take a viewing angle that shows the coin's roundness. Thus, we do not find, as we do in Western painting, the butt or the underside of horses, human bodies laid out with feet or head jutting towards the viewer, the men's hands and arms stretched out at the viewer. Human heads are seen in profile or full-faced or intermediately, but always from about eye level and never from extremely high or low angles such as to offer distorted shapes. Chinese painters do not foreshorten and do not seek those occasions where such perspectives are needed. The complex battle scenes with their helter-skelter actions and strewn bodies, or the complex architectural settings, which are favored in Renaissance paintings because they extend into the depicted space the linearity of the rooms in which the paintings are exhibited. Even in the very sophisticated Chinese representations of orchids or bamboos, we always see a sidewise view of things. If a leaf comes forward, it is bent downwards so that the full privileged leaf form is laid out. You can look over Sun Ke's myriad bamboos in the Freer Gallery without finding a single leaf that does not splay sidewise. The question of depth in Chinese paintings is always localized, a problem of roundedness of the object treated through form and texture. A larger view is a matter of integrating many local views rather than the attempt to create a unitary space that relates all the objects to each other and to a single eye. This multiplicity of local views, then, gives us the impression of a narrative through the painting. The use of privileged angles of view suggests to me that Chinese representations favor the conceptually recognizable over the purely visual. If we think of the treatment of distant mountains in Song paintings, the majestic towering boulders, the crazy patterns of jagged lines, the fuzzy mist-formed hills, the teetering piles, or the precipitous escarpments, we realize that these forms are what Ernst Gombrich called conceptual, as distinct from visual or illusionistic representations. The phrases we use to speak about these forms do not so much describe their optical forms as identify their derivations out of conceptual sources, that is, out of metaphors or images in the mental meaning of the term. There is, I am asserting, a very subtle graphic quality to the symbolic images of Chinese painting. The landscape experiences are transformed in the paintings through symbols whose visual resemblance to their objects are mediated by conceptual images or imaginaries, and in this sense, entering a painting proceeds along a literal narrative. In the various early moments of Chinese culture, visual representations are hardly distinguishable from graphs. And it may be that both the development of visual images and of graphic writing have kept to their roots. Not only, then, does the depiction not turn into a window with its totalitarian and inviolable exclusiveness, but it remains somewhat a grouping of visible conceptualizations on a sheet of paper. It remains enough like a text to be traditionally treated as a document. It is stamped with seals, which is what we do with written documents, and kept in scrolls and albums. Like other writings, the painting has dynamic value only in the symbols themselves, in the actual brushstrokes, or in the conceited representations of mist or snow. All the other areas of the paper are blank, in contrast to Western paintings, which are always filled with space, even when empty, and thus are inviolable. And so the Chinese painting is full of blanks, in which the collector writes his colophons. Sometimes the painted paper is so full of colophons and collector's seals that the painting and the painter's own inscription and signature seem overwhelmed. This effacement of the artist, however, fits the Chinese artist's stance. His inscription is one of those places for the use of a humility topos, like the one with which I began this talk: eulogies, dedications, gift givings, etc. This self-effacement is often signed with a hao, or an abbreviated signature, further removing the artist to the painting's edge in favor of the elite world to which the painting is offered, the world represented by the colophons, to the collector's world. Among the different names Chinese use, only the hao is a completely personal, private name. As we descend down the order of naming from Ming to Zi to Hao, we go from more certain to less certain public identity. The public for these names, identity having significance only publicly, narrows from the world at large to the small private circle, so that on the level of Hao, we are dealing with an identity in which the public self is effaced as much as possible. When a Taoist or Buddhist monk takes a Hao, it signifies not only the separation of the monk from the family, because the Hao is deliberately not used with the family name, but also from the whole social apparatus of the state, freed as he is then from the responsibility of taxation, etc. Similarly, the artist or poet's Hao rids him of a former worldly social identity. An example, Zhang Jiatian often signed his paintings 大千义者元. Yuan is his given official personal name. Yi means leisure, but also hidden, escaped, absconded, reclusive, derived from its root image of a running rabbit, right, a tu with a big foot under it. His signature might be understood as Da Qian, the retired version of Yuan. Of course, the hao is very often a conceited witticism and involves the joke that a name seemingly understood only to a small coterie of those in the know can also be known by everyone. Yet, even in pretense, the hao's form is self-effacing and deferential. If the artist in his social being is not center stage in Chinese art, then who is? I've been hinting that Qianlong got it right with his big seal up front and center. He or the collector is the picture's focus, covering the page not only with signs of ownership, but with appreciations, judgments, narratives of those journeys through the paintings, indeed texts documenting the history of the piece in a world of cultural values. To this world of history and tradition, the Chinese artist defers, and so in dealing with Chinese art, one might consider revising the traditional Western topos about art. Art is not what the artist makes, but what the collector collects. The colophons are more than addenda to the painting. They are the signifying part. They validate the painting as art. The artist may be what Aristotle called the efficient cause of the painting, but its final cause is its reception by the culture into the status of artwork, into what André Malraux called the imaginary museum. This market topos of art is well known. Art historians commonly base their practice on its assumption, always attending seriously to the colophons and seals, probing questions of fame and influence, and conscious of the history of taste. But they hedge their bets. The biographical urge still dominates Chinese art history. The verification of authenticity is still of primary importance in modern connoisseurship. This conference attempts to rebalance the issues, and I would hope that somewhere in it will be a discussion of the Chu Shuiliang calligraphy piece in the Ye collection, which, if the colophons are genuine, has been considered high art since the early 10th century, though it lacks any evidence as an authentic work. Would the shape of art history change? Would our understanding of Chu Shuiliang change if the piece were authenticated as the only extant work by him? I hope such a topic might lead to the consideration of how many of those great names of the ancient world are in fact not identity markers, as linguists say, but class names designating styles rather than individuals. Such a distinction might have significant consequences on the notion of authenticity. So steeped is that subject with the mythology of great masters and with the Western notions of stylistic individuality. I have now said the trite and the foolish, so I turn to the last part, which is the presumptuous. An art history that uses this topos would clarify several problems. First, it would take apart the strange notion of quality. That quality is related to history, the assumption that somehow great art or great artists determine history, the Napoleon myth, right? Quality does not inhere in the object, but devolves from interpretation. As such, it changes with the culture, that is, with the market. The notion of great masters treats the canon as a given and completely disregards the complex concatenations that produce it, what George Kugler described as an artist's entrance into the dynamics of changing forms. Second, since many things are collected besides those things that artists make, it would broaden art, making it more closely allied to the culture as a whole. Third, by focusing on the market, Art history contextualizes itself in social and economic history, providing a basis for understanding the class structure of art, a structure from which art history should be but is not always free. Artworks are luxury items, and their social significance lies in that fact. To ignore it resembles contemplating the meaning of diamonds by studying their production. Fourth, in focusing on those values that have preserved artworks, the art historian recognizes the self-referentiality of the historical process. The historian creates history and is not just a conduit for a pre-existent past. The historian is part of the history that he or she constructs. Fifth, my theme. There is a subtle but crucial difference between hegemony and universality, and neither an artist-centered nor an art-centered history can escape hegemony, whereas an art history based on the market, on collecting and preserving, takes a more anthropological and thus universally human stance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max, for getting us off to a wonderful start this morning. Our next speaker is a great friend of Berkeley, Richard Vinograd, who indeed got his PhD here under James Cahill and was a classmate of mine back in the old days. At present, and for quite some time, he has been the Christensen Professor in Asian Art in the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford University. He's the author of a wonderful book on portraiture, Boundaries of the Self, Chinese Portraits 1600 to 1900, published in 1992. And he was the co-author of Chinese Art and Culture, published in 2001, which has become the standard text for the teaching of Chinese art history now. He is also the author, of course, of numerous articles and essays on Chinese painting and aesthetics. Today he joins us to speak on the topic of collecting in public, which will move us directly into the Republican period and open up the panel for the rest of the morning. Thank you so much. Let's welcome Rick Vinograd.
Thanks very much, Pat. It's nice to be here, back here, as I often am. And let's see if we can get this to wake up. So this is actually like the first time I've ever done a PowerPoint in public, speaking of being in public. And I occasionally use digital presentations now in my teaching, and my students actually laugh at me because they're so lame. And that's my humility topos, but it's a deserved one. So, but I woke up this morning and I realized my talk is about mediation, and the PowerPoint medium has its own conventions, and I realized that unlike a slide illustrated lecture, you're supposed to have like a title page. So I put one together, such as it is. So the period that I'm concerned with, the late Qing and early Republican period, the 19th and early 20th centuries, they're the focus of the Ye family collecting activities and of this conference. And they were, I think, very pivotal to the construction of our present-day histories of Chinese art. All the more so, I would say, in that these eras, late Qing and early Republican eras, operate almost surreptitiously on and within our art historical discourses. Putting it that way, of course, places the agency on the wrong side of the ledger, because it was rather that this period has been suppressed or repressed into our present-day art historical unconscious. So why should this be so? Partly, I think it may have to do with an anxiety of influence or a matter of just academic procedure, since scholarship tends to proceed according to a logic of critique and revision. But in any case, this turn of the century era has suffered its corrections and displacements already a couple of generations ago. But it may be also that this casting of the late 19th, early 20th century into our disciplinary shadows until quite recently may largely be due to an almost aesthetic rejection of this period's relatively crude visual technologies, its clumsy nationalisms and ethnocentrisms, which are much less well or energetically disguised than our own, and of its bric-a-brac acceptance of just about everything in the enthusiastic and, at that time, a novel quest to study, collect, and preserve the past. Happily, though, this neglect of this era is rapidly changing with the efforts of scholars like Kuei Shun and Judy Andrews, who are with us here today, or many others, Rudolf Wagner and Catherine Ye and so on, with their studies of turn-of-the-century Shanghai media and many, many others. So what I would like to talk about a bit is just one aspect of this period, which I call collecting in public. When the organizers of the conference asked me to participate and to focus on, especially on this era of transition from empire to republic, I was more than a little reluctant because I'm someone who knows very little about a whole lot of topics, and this is one of them. That's humility topos number 2, I guess, but all too true. It occurred to me, though, that I and many other students of Chinese painting actually know a lot about this era, though again it's in a kind of unconscious experiential way, and it's through immersion in the art publications of the time, especially true of students of the subject of Pat and my era. The so-called Shanghai Ban art periodicals and reproduction albums were in fact a staple of our now fairly long ago graduate education here at Berkeley. Jim Cale had a large personal collection of these publications, which he kept in the graduate study seminar room for us to peruse. And through this, though this material was even then being supplanted by more systematic photographic and slide archives, these kinds of publications were invaluable augmentations of other resources. And they were especially illuminating about the history of private collecting in Shanghai and other nearby regions, and about exchanges between China and Japan. It's just that I, and I think many others, tended to use these kinds of publications as transparent repositories of information, to be literally looked through as if they were transparent, rather than looking at them as cultural objects in their own interesting right. In fact, when I pulled some of them off some of the dustier portions of my bookshelves, a few of the scattered journals of this particular type, this is one called Zhongguo Minghua, the famous Chinese paintings, I noticed for the first time ever that they have, they're thread-bound volumes, and they have multicolored threads as part of the binding. I don't know what that means, but it's something I noticed when I started to look at them as an object. So that's what I'd like to do this morning, to focus more closely on these early illustrated art publications. By collecting in public, I mean first to emphasize that most significant dimension of Chinese collecting culture in this era, which is the movement from a private sphere of collections and their cataloged texts, just texts only for the most part, to a public media dimension. Not yet a fully public institutional dimension of museum culture, although that's beginning also at this time, but a media dimension of photographic or photolithographic or collotype illustrated art publications. There's quite an explosion of these kinds of publications in the early 20th century, bridging the last years of empire and the early years of the Republic. And because of that congruence, there's an inescapable political horizon to this phenomenon, and not only because of the temporal coincidence. And in fact, I'll have more to say probably about collecting in politics than about the art of collecting, whatever that may be. So this is one such publication, Famous Chinese Paintings, published by the Youzhong Press, as it says on the cover. It was a periodical that began around 1920 and extended over some 40 issues, at least until 1926. It's not by any means the earliest of such publications. This Shenzhou Guoguangji started in the late Qing period, actually in 1908, and continued right up until the beginning of the Republican era in 1912. And the entire genre may well have been stimulated in turn by precedent Japanese publications of this sort, that is, illustrated art journals. These Shanghai publications have some links to the elite collecting culture of the imperial age. This one, the Shenzhou Guoguangji, often, as it does here, reproduced calligraphy by Wu Changshi on its cover. That's Wu, a portrait of him, made by his teacher Ren Bonyan on the right. I just put it there to show his calligraphy, but for comparison. Wu Changshi was involved with the Xiling Seal Society group based in Hangzhou's West Lake. But they also served as vehicles, for art society-based collecting and exhibition practices, and eventually helped constitute at least a proto-public art and museum culture that might be marked by another public kind of publication, those produced by the Palace Museum starting in the late 1920s and early 1930s, when the Palace Museum was up and running as a public institution. In this transitional era, I just show part of that social change. This is a group portrait of, including a self-portrait of Ren Bonyan and two of his associates, one of whom is an art dealer. So there's a transition already underway in the late 19th century between the elite world of private collectors to a kind of dealer-based art economy, and then on to an art society-based art world, and then eventually, as I say, to a emerging museum culture. In this transitional era, the Shenzhou Guoguangji, the publication we were just looking at, for example, included works that were selected by an ancient paintings exhibition association. This is just a random sample page from that early 1900s publication. It usually gives the medium and the exact dimensions of the objects illustrated, includes all kinds of things beyond just paintings or rubbings of calligraphy and rubbings of stone Buddhist sculpture and so on. And it often identifies the private collection from which the object emerges or where it resides. The other publication, the one that I'm going to focus on, partly because of its publisher, Di Pingzi, Famous Chinese Paintings, also usually identifies the collection or the collectors of its included objects, but it's usually less careful about particulars like dimensions. It does include some interesting anecdotal information, though, that, for example, the objects in a given issue were exhibited in the Yuyuan Garden in Shanghai and vetted by art society members. This is, of course, now a famous work that's in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, a Shagway landscape hand scroll. Or that a given piece sold for a high price to a Japanese collector, in this case because of its Buddhist subject matter and its inscription by a famous Zen monk, and then resold for 10 times that original purchase price, as in this case. So these publications made informative visual documentation of a wide range of collections and collectibles accessible to a relatively public audience. They certainly added to the renown of the included collectors and collections, and they probably augmented the market values of the objects included as well, with the implied imprimatur of their elite editorial groups or some of these exhibition societies or art societies and so on. However, putting collecting in the public eye in this way through these broadly disseminated journals was, of course, a double-edged sword with lots of benefits, but also the potential pitfalls of exposing errors in judgment or dubious taste to wide critical scrutiny. The art of collecting, if art it is, I think often resides in publicizing the winners and burying or deaccessioning the mistakes. So in that sense, I'm not sure how artful these publications are. They certainly include, in this famous Chinese painting series, lots of questionable works. This one's attributed to Zhou Wenju in the inscription, and it's supposed to have a huizong, that is all 10th, 11th century or early 12th century artists or collectors, and that's probably not quite right. But at any rate, as a group, these publications are a mixture of scholarship and connoisseurship, of advertisement and publicity, sometimes for other publications from the same publishing house. And they're not especially good at smoothing over the seams between these various purposes. And in that sense, perhaps they're more earnest than adept, or seem that way to us today. I should add, although I won't really have time to talk about it in detail, that there is a long prehistory of illustrated art publications, and that really would be the subject for another much longer presentation. But catalogs, manuals, inventories of all kinds that were produced in various forms in China, some from quite early times, including catalogs of bronzes and other antiquities that were supposed to have been illustrated with woodblock illustrations produced as early as the late Northern Sung period in the early 12th centuries. And I'll just run through a whole sequence of these. They're interesting as a group down through the ages. Sorry, this is pretty washed out at this scale, but this is a page from an early 17th century kind of woodblock illustrated catalog of paintings, and some of them can be identified with particular subjects or even particular paintings, although some others may have been, in fact, fabrications. And also illustrated manuals of painting, the famous Mustard Seed Garden Manual. This one includes a landscape associated with the Ming painter Tang Yin, although typically this is more broken down into particular motifs than into entire compositions. And all the way down to archival paintings and albums and so on produced at the Qianlong court in the 18th century that served to document particular, in this case, particular objects in the imperial collections, and even more recent to the period that I'm concerned with, lithographically illustrated painting manuals that were the kind of successors of the Mustard Seed Garden Manual that included contemporary paintings as illustrative materials. This one with an inscription dated to the late Qing, the Guangxu era, and this one a design associated with the mid-19th century painter Ren Xiong. So for the most part, though, this whole array of precedent illustrated art publications, whatever their function, whether catalogs or inventories or manuals, were either not particular enough or accurate enough in their reproductive technologies, or they were not broadly disseminated enough, and some, in fact, were limited to a court environment, to accomplish what these photographically or collotype illustrated journals that I began with could do. These early 20th century publications, on the other hand, were about more than just reproductive technology and about more than reaching a broad audience for its own sake. They may have been, just to return to this example, the famous Chinese paintings, they've been the closest things to glossy art magazines of their day, but they aren't, of course, very glossy, and earnestness is more to their point. I bring this kind of, other than the multicolored binding threads, sort of uninteresting cover to your attention just because of the calligraphy of the title, which is written by a man named Zhang Jian, who actually signs his name below it. So the cover is a bit of calligraphic cover art, one might say. But he was an interesting, important political activist and industrial reformer, and also an associate of the publisher of this, the Youzheng publishing house. Sorry, I'm not sure which is the last button. Yeah, this is just the title, the name of the publishing house. who is really the proper subject of my paper. This is a man, Di Pingze, whom I started, or Di Baoxian. The calligrapher, Zhang Jian, was also the organizing force behind the Nantong Museum, which was founded in 1905. Very diverse collection of natural history, educational, historical, and artistic materials, which my former student, Lisa Claypool, has written about in great detail as China's first, so to speak, non-colonial museum. In addition to writing calligraphy for the covers of this journal, he wrote a colophon for Di Pingze to accompany another 2-volume kind of compilation of the collected famous Chinese paintings. I have the title page on my introductory slide. And in it, he suggests a much broader political purpose for art publications. I won't, this is the little essay, and because of time, I won't translate it in detail, but he talks about this Di Pingze, the master of the Pingdunga, the Equality Pavilion. He has a collection of famous paintings, ancient and modern. He used glass plate printing to produce this series of publications. His intent is to use the fine arts. He uses at that time, modern locution mei shu, probably borrowed from Japan for the fine arts, as a fresh atmosphere for practical arts education. He goes on to talk about his sojourn, this is Zhang Jian, in Japan, and the way that Japanese, he says, customs study the Occident, study the West, and compared with China, they are either closer to the West or more modernized than China of his time, of the time he's writing, which is 1908, is. And he says there are a couple of reasons for this. The first is the Japanese esteem of beauty, and the second is their love of cleanliness or hygiene. And at any rate, he says it's not that departing from the Chinese way will inevitably result in riches and achievement, but that their people possess these habits. So he's talking about a kind of political acculturation that needs to be transformed into custom for this to have a profound effect on any given social or national group. And he goes on to conclude that this, talking about this compilation of famous Chinese paintings, Di Baoxian's effort to compile and disseminate paintings must be said to be related to the course of contemporary events. So his prologue to this collection, which is a reproduction book of Chinese paintings, positions Di Baoxian or Di Pingze's project within multiple overlapping contexts of technological and social modernization, the printing technologies that he talks about, of education, of international comparison, of China with Japan, and of both with the West, with the Occident, and also a context of political culture. The writer, Zhang Jian, was an industrial reformer, a pioneer of museum culture, as I've said, and a political activist. And the person to whom he's addressing this essay, and who's the publisher of this collection, Di Pingze, had an equally multifaceted career. He's perhaps better known for his reformist political activities than as an art collector. Along with the exiled Liang Qichao, he founded the newspaper Shibao, Eastern Times, as it's rendered, in 1904, which served as a vehicle for reformist political analysis and critique of the fading Qing regime. According to various accounts, Di had been involved in the ill-fated 100 Days Reform movement of the Guangxu Emperor in 1898, later with uprisings in Hunan, efforts to establish a parliamentary system in China, and even part of the planning for a coup d'etat against the Qing. Very interesting guy. And spent a period of self-imposed exile or escape from Qing reprisals for this kind of political activity in Japan after those political movements failed. And this photograph of him in Western dress, as you see, made in 1900, may well have been made while he was in Japan, in fact, though I'm not sure of that. So the public for Di Pingze's art publications was more than just a general mass audience, appealed to by technical innovations such as the collotype printing process, which he pioneered with the help of Japanese technicians. It was actually a specifically political public, not only addressed I think, but in some ways, as Zhang Jian's prologue suggests, constructed by these very publications. That is, the idea is that art publications of this type will have a transformative effect on their viewers and readers and change their political consciousness. That's according, again, to Zhang Jian's logic of cultural education, political acculturation, and modernization. This kind of project had many other manifestations. Chen Shizheng's famous Viewing Pictures and Exhibition of 1917 that Jonathan showed last night, embodies, again, both the public environments and public purposes of art exhibition, viewing, and collecting. The exhibition in a public park, open to a diverse audience, and with a philanthropic purpose to raise funds for disaster victim relief. And the same is true of this exhibition that I started with from 1936, which was a charity exhibition and sale of a private collection. After 1904, Di Pingze seems to have turned to publishing and cultural outlets. It's a pretty grainy photograph at this scale, sorry, but this is a later photograph of him in 1932. And it turned mostly to publishing and cultural endeavors rather than direct political action. The Shibao newspaper and the Youzheng press were the more and less explicit organs for his views. The newspaper espoused an explicitly reformist agenda, accompanied by a pioneering use of political cartoons. The Youzheng press published art serials and reproduction books, but also periodicals addressed to specific social constituencies, educators, women, and Buddhists, among other specific magazine topics, let's say. Even the specifically art publications, which can be quite laconic in their textual apparatus, evoke some of the same purposes. A preface composed by one of Di's newspaper editors for the 2-volume compilation of collected Chinese famous paintings mentions Di's use of the newspaper to advocate revolutionary reforms through the power of the press. He also founded the Youzheng Book Company, which published that painting catalog and that journal for the preservation of China's national culture by advancing the cause of Chinese art. Now, this might be dismissed. He was also a painter, I should say, and interestingly, some of his paintings were exhibited internationally. This is one that I found in an old journal from a 1930 exhibition in Berlin. This is the full group with his painting among them. So among his publics were an international art viewing public as well. Anyway, these introductory sentiments about the power of the press, one might say, might be dismissed as so much high-minded sentiment, but the political horizon of art collecting and publishing occasionally reached down even into the materiality and the heart of his private collection. I actually came to be interested in Di Pingze long ago, not by chance, but because he was the owner of Wang Meng's dwelling in reclusion in the Qingbian Mountains. This hanging scroll that you see that was a little bit washed out at this scale again, but it was one of the focal paintings in my doctoral dissertation when I was a student here. This painting was owned by Di Pingze, and it was inherited from his father, so it again continues the theme of family collecting. And within his writings, there's a collection of Di's, collected works extant. The painting is placed within a horizon of political pressure and emotional attachment. Di's father was a magistrate who retained the Qingbian Mountains, the scroll, at a cost to his career and a cost also to the well-being of the populace under his administration. When he refused, this is in the 1860s, when he refused the request of a superior to relinquish this painting, to hand it over, the superior harbored a resentment against Di Pingze's father, and it's a long, complicated, but fascinating story, and it allowed, at any rate, a local clan dispute to escalate into a putative rebellion that eventually required occupying troops to suppress. Finally, under the pressure of his exhausting workload and concern for the plight of the local populace, Dee's father agreed to give up, actually not this painting, but his other most treasured work, a portrait album of the Five Elders, another famous work, which now is split between various collections in the U.S. He quotes his father as saying, "For the sake of a single painting," meaning particularly this one, "I kill myself and ruin my family." Within the two-volume collected Chinese paintings catalog, otherwise, as I say, mostly laconic, very laconic about the included objects, the Qingbian Mountains is reproduced unusually along with its calligraphic accompaniments, actually more than appear on this image, but including Di Ping's long essay about the history of the painting, his personal and family relationship to it. This autobiographical account, which is actually dated 1928, and so exactly 60 years after the events of his narrative about his father. And it's reproduced in this book almost as prominently as the painting itself. So while this one painting marks a transit between the personal collecting culture of late imperial China, of Di Ping's father, on the one hand, and the public and technologically mediated collecting activities of the Republican era, in which Di Ping's played so major a part, ironically, the political entanglements generated by this painting were, if anything, even more widespread and more socially potent, even more violent in his father's day than in his own. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick, for that. That's a really fascinating subject. And it takes me back to the day when we sat in that seminar room with all of those volumes disintegrating because the paper was loaded with acid. And I remember moving them out after Professor Cahill retired and having them fall apart in our hands. So I'm glad you still have some. Our third speaker is Catherine Burnett, and it's also a very great pleasure to introduce her. She's a colleague who is an associate professor of art history at the University of California at Davis. And her interests include art and criticism of the Ming, Qing, and early Republican periods. She is presently completing a book on the subject of her talk today, that is on the collector Pang Yuanji, who lived between 1864 and 1949, entitled Artist, Patron, Collector, Dealer. Today, she comes to us to talk specifically about aspects of his taste in a paper entitled Late Qing, Early Republican Period Taste and the Case of Pang Yuanji. So please join me in welcoming Catherine Burnett.
Thank you, Pat. It is a great honor to be here today, and I also want to thank Max and his sister for generously giving the collection to the Asian Art Museum. It is a wonderful addition to a wonderful collection, and it will be terrific for us to study and send our students to study and learn much more about this fascinating and complicated and stimulating culture, and it's just a terrific thing. Thank you. Well, my talk today is on the late Qing and early Republican period taste and the case of Pang Yuanji. And I think about sometimes, why do people collect what they do? This is a complicated question, so let's narrow it to ask, why did collectors such as the Ye family and their contemporaries collect what they did? Because the Ye family collections have been well examined by other more distinguished scholars, I turn my attention to a contemporary of Ye Gongchuo, the Shanghai industrialist Pang Yuanji, to see what his collection can tell us about the matter. Let's see. I'm pressing the wrong button somewhere. Push the down one. One of these buttons will work. There we go. Okay, so it's okay. And then we'll push this one. Oh, okay, okay. Okay, I think I know where I am. All right, so there's a photograph of Pang on the right. He was a leading collector in Southeast China. Although he collected many different types of fine arts, including calligraphy, ceramics, and snuff bottles, his painting collection was his focus. Pang is important because, as will be demonstrated in a moment, his collection is emblematic of late Qing, early Republican period collecting values. Consequently, when we ask how the collection of art shifted in the 20th century, a collection like Pang's can help to establish a standard against which to determine what is modern. Pang's family traced their ancestry back to the late Song, early Yuan official Pang Po. Pang Yuanji and his recent ancestors also held official rank in the imperial bureaucracy, though his Xiuzai degree was purchased. No doubt, this background was a boon in the Pang family's commercial endeavors. The bulk of the family estate developed from silk production, which Pang Yuanji's father developed in the family's hometown of Nanxun, with offices in Shanghai, and there's a photograph of Nanxun on the left. To this, he added the diverse businesses of drug manufacturing, munitions support, real estate, and a hospital. The son, Pang Yuanji, Zi Lai Qian Hao Shuzhai, further enhanced his family's fortunes and diversified their holdings through the expansion of more silk and textile factories, as well as electricity companies, paper factories, a soda company, and investments in the Bank of China, as well as the Zhejiang Commercial Bank in Shanghai, Nanxun, Suzhou, and Hangzhou. Well supplied with ample capital, Pang Yuanji developed one of the largest, if not the largest, private collections of important paintings outside of the imperial palace in Beijing. In addition to their significant collections of art, Pang Yuanji and some of the members of the Ye family had other activities in common. Both Pang and Ye Gongchuo were respected figures in the Shanghai arts community and served as advisors for the first major exhibition of ancient Chinese art outside of Asia at the London Royal Academy of Arts in 1935 and 36. Pang Yuanji's collection also makes an interesting contrast with that of the Ye family. Whereas the Ye collection was nurtured and transformed over several generations, Pang Yuanji assembled his collection himself. And whereas the Ye family collection is especially known for its important calligraphies, Pang primarily focused his attention on painting. Pang Yuanji did collect other antiquities, but painting was his first love, and when the Chinese government wished to rebuild art collections after 1950 for the Palace Museum in Beijing and the Shanghai Museum, Pang's collection was targeted for acquisition because of its size and importance. Pang began collecting around 1885 when he was about 20 years old because, as he claimed, he simply loved paintings. No doubt, a desire to accumulate cultural capital to match his vast economic resources must have been a factor in his ambitious collection strategy. Pang particularly loved the paintings of the Qing Orthodox masters, such as the one on the screen, although that I don't think was in his collection, and began his collection with these. The style utilized by these artists asserted a correctness of aesthetic, cultural, and political lineage that was promoted by the Manchu Qing courts and supported by the outside art market. Pang then gradually accumulated works from each dynasty, purportedly back to the Tang, to develop a comprehensive collection that included paintings by artists from most standard art historical categories. Pang's collection was both broad and deep. He owned multiple examples of works by single important artists, and these include some of the biggest names in Chinese painting history. These include Yan Li Ben, Han Gan, Zhou Fang, Zhao Yan, Dong Yuan, Fan Quan, Guo Xi, Zhao Lingrang, Emperor Huizong, Zhao Boju, Ma Yuan, Xia Gui, the four great masters of the Yuan, the four great masters of the Ming, the four Wang and six masters, and most of the 9 friends of painting, including Dong Qi Chang. I mean, this goes on and on and on. At the same time, Pang's collection displays notable gaps. What is significantly missing from Pang's collection are the bolder representations of artists who forcefully challenged the literati status quo, such as the late Ming painters Song Shu on the left and Wu Bin on the right, 2 examples that have been in area collections. The one on the left was in the Qingyuanzhai collection, and on the right, the Wu Bin landscape is in the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, and hopefully we get to see it again when it becomes on display sometime in our near future. Also missing from the collection are representatives of contemporaneous artists that Pang respected and patronized, such as Wu Changshuo, who inscribed one of Pang's catalogs, and Zhang Daqian, Wu Changshuo's painting is on the left, and Zhang Daqian, whom Pang commissioned to complete an album of paintings, or even Lu Hui, a Shanghai-style painter living in Pang's household as one of his collection's advisors. None of these artists' work appear in the catalogs. Also excluded are the European-style paintings that many cultural leaders promoted as part of China's modernization efforts. Though Pang's collection has long been dispersed, it is possible to reconstruct a sense of what his collection contained from examining his collection's catalogs. The idea of a collection catalog is no more unusual to us today than it was in Peng Yuanji's time, yet the organizational comprehensiveness of his catalogs sets them apart from most that were produced by China's collectors by that time and makes them invaluable research tools for scholars today. The most notable of Pang's numerous texts are the Shujai Minghua Lu of 1909 and its sequel, Shujai Minghua Xu Lu of 1924 and appendix of 1925. These catalogs record only those paintings he kept at his home in Nanxun. They exclude paintings in his other households and those that filtered in and out of his collection between the years of publication 1909 and 24. And, of course, they are necessarily silent to the paintings that he would acquire after 1925. It is impossible to locate all the paintings that were once in his collection, but it is possible to track down some of the objects that he once did own. Most now are in the collections of the Shanghai Museum and the Suzhou Municipal Museum. Some are in a few American examples. Some examples are this Gongkai Zhonghui the Demon Queller that's now in the Freer and Sackler galleries. Another example is Nizan's Autumn Clearing over a Fishing Lodge in the Shanghai Museum. And another is the Early Spring that bears the signature of Chen Xuan, in the Detroit Institute of Arts. Just some of many, many. Without examining all of the paintings in his collection, it is, of course, impossible to assess the overall quality of his collection. Nevertheless, we can deduce that he owns some of the most important paintings that China has ever produced. Even though Pang was collecting in a time before Chinese museums were open to the public and before good quality reproductions of important artworks became available, he assembled an enviable collection. Although we cannot precisely assess the quality of Pang's collection, valuable insights can be garnered by quantifying it. Here, what is important is what Pang claimed he owned, as outlined in his catalogs, because this indicates what he wanted others to believe to be true. This analysis provides important data with which to assess Pang's taste and aesthetic values. From this, we can determine if these were idiosyncratic or representative of late imperial, early republican standards. This information is crucial in determining what shifts occurred in collectors' aesthetics in the 20th century when Chinese intellectuals intensified efforts to modernize their social and cultural institutions. The total number of paintings recorded in these catalogs is 763. For the sake of comparison, the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco now holds about 850 Chinese paintings. For the purposes of computation, paintings mounted together on a single scroll or bound together in an album are counted as one. I analyzed the number of paintings by dynasty and by subject matter. Because I worked from textual descriptions rather than originals or reproductions, some inaccuracy inevitably may exist in my calculations. Nevertheless, the computations are functional as broad indicators of the general composition of the collection. Not surprisingly, with recent paintings most likely to survive the exigencies of time, slightly over half of Pang's collection, over 51%, is dated to the Qing period. Almost a third was from the Ming and fewer from each previous dynasty. Because Pang was so wealthy that he could have collected anything, the figures reveal that he preferred the landscape genre to anything else, and paintings in the literati mode regardless of genre above all else. Here, I rely upon standard categories of Chinese painting to define literati, as classified by Kontag and Wang in their seals of Chinese paintings, of Chinese painters and collectors from the Ming and Qing periods. The bulk of Pang's collection, over 65%, consisted of landscape paintings. Almost 18% of the collection was of miscellaneous literati subject matter. where this indicates paintings of rocks, gardens, old trees, etc., but not flowers. Just over 6% were of figures, over 5% were of flower paintings, over 3% were of animals, and a mere 2%, 16 paintings, were in the bird and flower genre. A more detailed analysis is included in my lengthier study of Pang Yuanji. Pang Yuanji's quantifiable penchant for literati-style works is significant. Preference for the literati styles over the academic is not a constant throughout the whole of Chinese painting history. The question is, was Pang's taste unique to its time? In fact, when Pang Yuanji's collection is quantitatively compared to the catalogued large-scale painting collections of his contemporaries, the results are startlingly similar. The collections I analyzed belong to Xiao Songnian of Changshu, Jiangsu Province, and Pei Jingfu of Huaqiu, Anhui. Like Pang, these men's wealth enabled them to collect whatever their hearts desired. Xiao Songnian catalogued his collection in the Guyuan Cui Lu, preface dated to 1903. It was published in 1905, just 5 years before Pang's Shujai Minghua Lu. Pei Jingfu inventoried his collection in the Zhuangtaoke Shuhua Lu. Although this catalog was not published until 1937, it actually was compiled in 1923, just 1 year before the Shujai Minghua Lu. These texts, therefore, effectively bracket in Pang's most important catalogs, and consequently, analysis of them accordingly increases our knowledge of collecting and values of this time. Xiao Songnian and Pei Jingfu collected and cataloged their holdings of calligraphy as well as of painting, but my concern is with their painting collections. According to the works recorded in their catalogs, both men owned about the same number of paintings. Xiao listed 397, Pei 395. Among the notable works in Xiao Songnian's collection were Zhao Mengfu's Mind Landscape of Xiaoyu Yu, now in the Princeton University Art Museum, and Shi Tao's Manuscript of Poems and Paintings, now in the Beijing Palace Museum. One of Pei Jingfu's most important paintings was Gu Tianzhi's Landscape in the Style of Huang Gongwang of 1649, which is now in the Cleveland Museum of Art. Like the Pang collection, the bulk of Xiao and Pei collections were of landscape or miscellaneous literati subject matter. About 70% of each of these two men's collections consisted of landscape paintings, very close to Pang's 65%. Difference among the three collectors is evident only in the subsidiary categories, and these differences are relatively minor. While Pang's second most collected genre was miscellaneous literati subject matter, exclusive of flowers, that is, of rocks, gardens, old trees, etc., for Xiao and Pei it was flower paintings. 13% of Xiao's collection consisted of flower paintings, and for Pei it was almost 11. Granted, this category of flowers could be of literati or academic style, and therefore I pulled it out as a data category. It is very difficult to discern only from texts which style it was in, and for that matter, the style of a work of art does not necessarily, of course, indicate the social or intellectual background of its maker. In any case, after that, both men preferred miscellaneous literati subject matter, Pang's second largest category. The least collected genre for both Pei and Pang was bird and flowers, though for Xiao it was paintings of animals. The broad swath similarities between the three collections indicates that though their owners were active in different parts of China, they participated in a broad period discourse that emphasized the literati mode and subject matter over the professional styles as the primary element of Chinese painting. Moreover, the fact that Pang Yuanji developed his collection on his own, while Xiao and Pei inherited most of theirs from family members, suggests relative stability in 19th to early 20th century collections, values, and taste among China's largest collectors. Therefore, any changes in acquisition patterns among 20th century modernists may helpfully be compared against them. One of the things that is interesting about the late 19th and early 20th century taste is reflected in painting collections like that of Pang Yuanji, Xiao Songnian, Pei Jingfu, and for that matter, the Ye family, is that by and large, this taste was conservative. While these men may have owned paintings by their contemporaries, and some of them were themselves painters, such works were excluded from their catalogs. This, despite the high-level participation of these men or their close family members in modernizing movements that would change China's political system, transform its economy, social structure, writing system, and modes of cultural production. What is significant about these collections, therefore, is that in contrast to the unstable times in which these collectors found themselves, their collections represent a staid and stable China, a China with an ordered society composed of scholars and officials, of a reliable, neatly classifiable status quo to which to turn at times of social and political upheaval. It seems to me, therefore, that these collections represent these men's efforts to look back on what China meant to them and an aspect of China's cultural greatness they wished to preserve in a changing, uncertain, modernizing, and internationalizing future. These collections, and therefore late Qing, early Republican elite values, promote an idealized notion that could be respected by political and cultural leaders the world around during a time of international change, and an ideal that collectors like Pang must have hoped would give modernity a respectable, if essentialized, past. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much to all three of you for really provocative and interesting papers. I'm elected in this case to serve as a discussant for these papers and to bring them together in what I hope will be a very brief statement, because I think we're running swiftly out of time. In fact, our time has elapsed. Nonetheless, I would like very much to try to speak to this issue of collecting, however briefly, and then open the floor quickly to questions. I think it's very interesting that we began with Max Ye's paper that constructed a rationale for a very different kind of art history, and put so eloquently as well, an art history that would be based not on a study of artists and their biographies, but rather on the issue of reception, and specifically of collecting. That is a kind of final reception. This, I think, opens up in the two papers from Catherine Burnett and Rick Vinograd into two very fascinating and very different case studies of Republican-era collectors that move in precisely the direction that I think Max Ye was advocating. In fact, there's been a great deal of art historical interest that's been directed at collecting recently. This isn't any less true for China, I think, where collectors have been the subject of many recent articles and exhibitions. The present exhibition at the Asian Art Museum, of course, of the Ye family collection is the latest. It's the one that brought us together, and it's one of the most interesting of this genre, I think, also because it aimed to trace a group of objects that grew and shifted as the generations passed. In other words, this collection and its building was a collaborative family effort, and it is newly complicated by the fact that the collection has now come into the public sphere. As Max Ye suggests, the signs of collecting, the seals, the signatures, the colophons of owners, often dominate the visual field of Chinese paintings, pushing the artist to the edge somewhat. We have to ask, I think, why this should be so. Contemporary theorists have argued that because the collection is not simply a random accumulation of things, but is assembled with goals or intentions that may clarify over time, the collection actually is a kind of self-portrait in a sense, or even a material substitute for the collector, and at the very least a showcase for his or her values, interests, and tastes, as well as a repository of symbolic and real capital. Now, as you know, collectors are often caricatured in literature. They're depicted as obsessed, generally, and this is very true, especially in French theoretical literature. They're even depicted as beyond obsessed, that is, willing to do anything to get their hands on the object that will complete their collections, in a sense, and even ready to die the minute their collections are done. This idea emerges in the writing of such theorists as Baudrillard, for example. They're said to have empathetic and even pathological relationships with their most beloved objects. Now, how much more complicated is this relationship in the case of a family collection, such as that of the Ye family, where, as Max Ye writes in his wonderful introductory essay to the Elegant Gathering Catalog, stories are thickened and enriched into family mythology. But as we hear from Catherine Burnett's exploration of the paintings owned by Pang Yuanji, collections are not stable. And in fact, it is this truth that led James Cahill to suggest the title In Pursuit of Mists and Clouds for the exhibition here at the Berkeley Art Museum just a few years ago that celebrated his own family's painting collections. The title was specifically designed to evoke the ephemerality of any collection and the general instability of any meaning generated by the collection through a reading of the relationships between its individual components. Still, as Catherine Burnett's paper shows, the act of cataloging or creating a permanent record of the collection's contents, and in the case of Peng Yuanji, of issuing regular supplements to keep up with high-powered acquisitions, ensures a kind of immortality of a sort, and I think can give us insights into the collector's goals and the values he built into his collection. Moreover, as we know, the seals and colophons he adds to verify his custodianship, or asks his friends to apply as well at certain moments of viewing to record their delight in his good fortune, add immense of just financial value to the painting, tracing as they do lines of appreciation and valuation back to the distant past. Now, as Max Yen notes, in the case of the Zhu Sui Liang calligraphy in the Ye family collection, this is a tracing that goes all the way back to the 10th century, though it must be said with a substantial 250-year gap just before the 15th century, so this complicates, I think, our reading of that. As time passes, the calligraphy or painting becomes a document of its own career, recording its moments of glory and also registering gaps during its moments of neglect. The catalog as an archive and as a site of memory, which is a task I think that the Elegant Gathering catalog accomplishes really superbly, actually seems to yearn for a statistical approach, especially once the paintings themselves have moved on to their separate careers, as in the case of Peng Yuanji's collection. So we learn that collectors like Peng adhered to traditional, indeed conservative patterns of acquisition, even as they may have espoused fairly radical social causes. As Catherine Burnett notes, the goal of such accumulation was to give the modern, in which they were deeply implicated in other ways, a, quote, respectable if essentialized past, end quote. And so we find modernity itself supported and contradicted by the very act of collecting historical paintings and calligraphies. Where is the rupture that produces the modern in this construction? Perhaps we might search for it in the increasingly clear-cut commodification of works of art. Perhaps, as Richard Vinograd has suggested, it has to be sought in the new public and technologically sophisticated cultures of display and appreciation that sought to assimilate progress, as he puts it, which was often foreign, to custom, which was specifically Chinese. This new culture was constructed in part through the medium of photography, promising access to what was actually unavailable to the public eye. In his analysis, we see a habit of collecting, I think, and publication also, that was determinedly tied to public promotion of other kinds of ideas as well, political and even publicly philanthropic causes. And so, in his case study, the dim, usually blurred images of Di Baoxian's Zhongguo Minghua proclaim two quite separate things, that is, the ownership of revered paintings, with all their implications of privileged intimacy and emotional charge, and control over a progressive, if foreign, technology, which was designed specifically to reproduce without prejudice. Access to both of these is given to the world in a breathtaking display of public spirit and generosity in the case of the Zhongguo Minghua, and I might add it in the case of the gift of the Ye family collection to the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. And now, since I'm way past the time that's been allotted to us, I would like to invite the givers of the papers to sit at the table and to open, however briefly, the floor to questions. Olga.
publications, open exhibits versus the politics of the time. And then the second practical question is there a record of how Peng got a hold of his paintings collection?
I'm going to let you speak on the publication aspect, but is there a record of how Peng acquired his collections? I think that he comments in his various catalogs on savvy purchases, the art market being in flux, and it just being lucky time for him to choose the cream of the crop that was coming to him, and people would come to him to offer objects. Yeah. I think that he might also have acquired some of his collection from Dipingzi.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very likely. In fact, these publications include a range of collections, including Peng Yuanji's, some things that are identified as belonging to him, and some things that are identified as having been in the imperial collection as well. So there's a real mixture of kind of collecting cultures that are brought together in these publications. And of course, there are specialist genres. The early Gugong and Gugong Jokan, Gugong Shunkan, and so on. I mean, the various publications that are specifically devoted to the Palace Museum collection as it was being made public and inventoried and so on. And that those are exclusively devoted to that imperial tradition.
Are you aware that Diping's collection was seized at the Cultural Revolution and was then sheltered by the Shanghai Museum and forms the basis for that collection?
Yeah.
So that it can still be seen in a fair degree of entirety.
And it's also the case, I just briefly mentioned Diping's as a painter, but there have been exhibitions of his paintings as well in Shanghai with the Doyunshan, I think.
I am curious about the concept of intellectual property in China in relation to the painters during that time. They do not seem to, it seems to me that the intellectual property of the painter is not as important, and whether or not this concept is reflected now in the modern times wherein Chinese does not seem to have very much respect for intellectual property.
That's a tough one. I mean, in terms of the prehistory of that, do you mean the tradition of copying and imitation and so on? It's true, but I think, again, sometimes they can be overdrawn as a contrast to the West. I mean, there was obviously corporate production and studio and atelier production and reproduction and imitation and forgery and so on in all the art traditions that we know about, especially in the West as well.
It's a very recent phenomenon in the West, generally speaking, the idea of private property, that there is intellectual property. I mean, you certainly don't find it in the Renaissance in the West. You don't find it in the 18th century. You begin finding it at the end of the 18th century. It's basically a product of industrialization and late capitalism, you know, about private property.
I'm always struggling with my Western perceptions of Eastern things. And the question I have is, historically, not currently, but more historically, did the Chinese collect artists or art?
Well, there were a lot of collections that were based on big names, and of course they might include a number of, you know, anonymous works and so on, but there certainly was a long-standing tradition of artist biographies. It was one of the major genres of art historical writing in China from earlier times, and maybe in some ways the most enduring one. And there are lots of, I mean, famous catalogs. Emperor Huizong's catalog in the 12th century is organized around, well, it's partly around genres, but also around particular artists and their surviving works and so on. So collecting artists and big name artists and so on, or particular strains of them as literati artists or what have you, was certainly one of the strategies for collecting.
At the same time, when you read some of the criticism of the artists, of the collectors who could be also artists commenting on the works that they found and acquired, they're thrilled at the quality. I can think of Dong Chi Chang quotation where he's saying, you know, I was over at so-and-so's house and I saw the most amazing Juran painting and an amazing, all these other amazing paintings, and there's just nothing better than them. And, you know, I was really lucky I acquired these. And I mean, he's so ecstatic, you know, the words practically jump off the page at you. You know, they're like collectors today, you know, there's a wide variety of why do people collect? But I think that at the nub, there's the desire to be able to be in close proximity to something that's stimulating and wonderful.
I'm particularly interested in the issue of the concept of taste. For example, in the case of Pang Yuanji, he's a merchant collector, and the facts of Xu Zhanming Hua Lu and Xu Lu actually all compiled and written by his advisors. So I'm just curious, how much does this reflect his taste and his value, or you know we all know during this transitional era, the role of the intellectual at that time, or even when the imperial collection was turning into from the emperor's possession to the people's, and the first group of the curators or advisors were brought in, how they evaluate, and this also related to when Chiang Kai-shek moved these 700,000 items to Taiwan, the standard for selecting these items. I see all this kind of interrelated, so I'm very curious. Can you comment more on this, or you know, how you evaluate all this?
Yeah, well, I'll try. It is a very complicated question, and no doubt this is just the tip of an iceberg of different kinds of collectors and impulses. I think that I was having an interesting conversation with Arnold Zhang yesterday about C.C. Wang's collection and what he was willing to collect. And there were things, it seemed to me that compared to Pang, he was relatively fearless. He was willing to expand into categories that were not such narrow areas as Pang seemed to focus on. And Pang as a merchant, you know, I hesitate to use the word merchant. Let's call him a business magnate. You know, that's fairer, I think, and more accurate. He had the money, and some people don't think he had the taste. He just had the money and the wherewithal and the advisors to help him out choose things. It's impossible to know, you know, where his taste ended and his advisors exclusively began, except for the fact that he also was a painter, and he painted in the Shanghai mode in the Shanghai style after the four Orthodox masters in the four Wang and six Orthodox masters. And that was his comfort zone. And then I think he wanted to collect to show a comprehensiveness of an understanding of Chinese history. How erudite he really was, that's a question I don't think that we can answer. But it's an interesting question to pose anyway.
I wanted to just return to the gentleman's question before Huixiu asked her question about, it was a great question, did Chinese artists, or did Chinese collectors collect paintings or artists? There was a bit of equivocation there from the panel, but I feel very strongly they collected artists. All you have to do is look at Dong Qichang's paintings and wonder why would somebody collect this? And you know they collected them, unless you had very unusual tastes, because Dong Qichang was so famous, and that happens repeatedly throughout Chinese history. Now, I happen to like Dong Qichang's painting, so I don't want to give the wrong impression, but sorry? Yeah. Well, okay, sorry. No, I do. I love Dong Qichang, but they do not strike the average person as something attractive, and yet nobody ever mentions that when they collect traditionally. Dong Qichang was great. Mi Fu in the 11th century, railed about people, forgeries. Everybody has to give a famous name to a painting. And occasionally he does remark that you know, this is a great painting, but it's by a minor artist, you know, forget the spurious signature on it. So it's very refreshing when you do come across those comments where somebody does... Well, that's secondary literature. Let's not go into that. But the point is that, you know, the name is extremely important, and even more so in calligraphy, where, you know, the handwriting associated with the person is so indelibly associated. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents on the subject. Sorry to Dong Chi Chang lovers out there.
I think we can have a couple more questions. We're really running extremely late, but I think there's a hand that's been up over here for quite some time.
Wouldn't this be a good point to speak to Max Yeh's question? You were saying you wanted somebody to speak to the Chu Sui Liang in the collection. I mean, it's in, that object is in the collection, I think, because it was important to have represented in the form of an autograph artifact of some kind. You know, one of the patriarchs of Chinese calligraphy. And it's true that in modern times, or in modernist collecting and in modernist interpretation, not so much collecting, but in the modernist interpretation of Chinese collections, those kinds of work, which may not in fact be by Chu Sui Liang, have been seen as beyond the pale, something to be excluded, something to be not to be taken seriously. And I was so pleased that you insisted that these works should be taken seriously, because they have a function to play in the overall collection. They have a function to play in the transmission of the cultural heritage. And modern art history doesn't really have a set of tools for doing justice to those works. Everything is considered a forgery, a copy, anything of that kind is really used in modernist art history to define the frontiers of what is respectable to study. And there's a vast range of material that was taken extremely seriously in pre-modern times, and which we today treat, as one of my students said, as a kind of aesthetic pornography. And this is, I feel, a great mistake. So I thought that was wonderful. Can I take issue with you, though, on one question? Or not take issue, but rather ask a question back. You're suggesting, you are advancing an argument that the Chinese artist was more deferential, that the Chinese artist, in a certain sense, dispersed himself or herself across the surface of the object. Now, I think that's true, but I'm not sure that it's totally incompatible with a kind of self-affirmation. I mean, it seems to me that traditionally in China, the self-affirmation didn't come through the image so much as through the mastery of the brushstroke, and you didn't speak to that. So how would you answer that challenge, so to speak? From the art, not from me, but from the art.
Yes. Yes, this is a gigantic whole about the relationship between hand stroke and the individual, which is what traditionally we claim for calligraphy. That is, as Peter said, this is that in calligraphy you are looking for the presence of the person in the actual formation of the characters. On the other hand, these are, we all know, learned gestures, and they are therefore not, in a sense, psychologically individual in a sense. I mean, after all calligraphers start by copying, right? And not even by copying, but, I mean, we have these books where you have sort of grayish characters, and it's almost like filling in the blanks kind of thing. And that trained your hand in a particular style. And all I'm asking is, does the relationship between the style and the personality of the doer, is that not in fact mediated by in fact art history? Right? So that should not art history understand its relationship as a mediating tool between the individual and the forms that he produces, rather than come at it from the other side, just assume that there is this direct relationship, an unmediated relationship between the hand and the person. Yeah, that's...
May I get in the fray of the thing? Before I ask the question, first thing, I'd like to go back to the painting about intellectual property, okay? From what I understand, that in the older days, Chinese historically, when a painter or a calligrapher, you created something, this is your creation, is for everybody to enjoy and to see. Is a creation, okay? It's priceless, as the other professors say, the guy would rather die than give up his painting, because there is no such a so-called Western way of value, dollar, cents, value to that. It's a priceless thing. Now, the other thing is the subjective thing that people like. Some people like Dong Qi-chang, people don't like Dong Qi-chang. That is number one, the guy who look at the painting, you must have some certain educational background, understanding painting, in order to appreciate certain things. Otherwise, you may not appreciate it, okay? Like, I don't like Picasso. And, that's something. Now, then it comes to this point about, this professor talked about the calligraphy writing, and you were talking about people learn, you have to learn the basic, the copybook, as we call, which is the technology of writing a Chinese character. But when you come down to create the calligraphy, sometimes it's come out of an inner inspiration. People say that you may, so some painters say that, I should, how should I say, clear the mind and get the inspiration. Then all of a sudden, at that time, that inspiration lead your hand into a certain force, certain stroke in creating that art. And that's a sense of creation. Now, my question was that we have never touched upon the point of collection. We talk about your family and the Pan family and all that. Don't forget that you may want to collect, but it may not be available. The availability comes from the time of economic, political upheavals in a country where people, in order to survive, they hate to give up their painting, but they have no choice but to sell it. And then you have a chance for the collector to collect. Otherwise, if nobody gives up their own painting, if everybody's living happy, it's very hard for you to go and collect and buy it. Don't you think so?
Yes, that's true. Actually, Professor Ye Wenxing has her article in the catalog addresses that and talks about the collection in the Ye family at a time of upheaval when the paintings suddenly became available. This is also the background of this kind of discussion about the end of the Qing dynasty and the beginning of the Republic. And this is the period when paintings suddenly become available because everyone's running around.
And that was one of the interesting things about studying Pang Yuanji is that I purposefully studied his collection and two others that were very, very large of people who had lots and lots of money, because it's their choice to collect what they want. It's somebody with smaller funds is only going to be able to make a selection, and they may really love all sorts of things, but can only afford just a small collection. Well, somebody like Pang is informative, therefore, because he could buy anything he wanted, and all sorts of things were on the market. And what we do see is certain patterns emerging from him and from his contemporaries, that this is what they wanted to be known for. It's a good question.
Okay, I see the finger across the throat, so I think we're going to stop our questions right now, at least for this portion.
So please be back at 1 o'clock for the session on calligraphy and poetry. Thank you.